They say the path to hell is paved with good intentions. In the case of O Beijoqueiro or the kisser, it may also have been paved with cheeks, foreheads, impulsive devotion, and a profound misunderstanding of where affection ends and violation begins. In Brazil's long and unruly tradition of urban folklore, there are figures who do not fit neatly into categories of hero or criminal. They are not admired, yet they are not entirely condemned. Instead, they linger in the cultural memory as symptoms, embodiments of a particular historical moment when social rules loosened, hierarchies wobbled, and the boundaries between the private body and public power were briefly unclear. The kisser belongs to this tradition. He was not a revolutionary, not a performer by design, and not a prankster seeking applause. He was a man whose repeated, unsolicited kisses forced Brazilian society to confront a series of uncomfortable questions: who owns public space, who controls intimacy when affection stops being harmless, and what happens when a society mistakes audacity for charm. His real name was José Alves de Moura, born in 1940 in Gondomar, Portugal. He immigrated to Brazil as a young man and died quietly in Rio de Janeiro in 2019. Between those two dates lies a life defined mostly by obscurity, except for a brief and volatile period in the early 1980s when his compulsion to kiss public figures turned him into one of the most unsettling characters of Brazil's post-dictatorship era. This is not a story of harmless eccentricity, nor is it simply a tale of untreated mental illness. It is a story about loneliness, recognition, cultural permissiveness, and the dangerous intimacy between freedom and intrusion. José Alves de Moura arrived in Brazil much like countless Portuguese immigrants before him, quietly, anonymously, and without ceremony. Portugal in the mid-20th century was still marked by economic stagnation and authoritarian control. Brazil, by contrast, promised warmth, scale, and the illusion of boundless opportunity. Yet for Moura, migration did not produce belonging. He lived on the margins of Rio de Janeiro, drifting between irregular work, unstable housing, and fragile social ties. He never achieved professional success or financial security. Those who later spoke about him described a man who could be gentle and affectionate, capable of humor and warmth, but also erratic and emotionally fragile. His inner life oscillated between lucidity and obsession, calm and fixation. Moura struggled with mental health issues and experienced periods of institutionalization. He was deeply sensitive to rejection. Indifference wounded him more than hostility. To be ignored was not merely unpleasant, it was annihilating. In a city as vast as Rio, anonymity can feel absolute. For Moura, invisibility became an existential threat. Brazil's cities do not make space easily for the marginal. Millions coexist without recognition. Those without money, status, or social capital pass through public space unseen. Moura internalized this invisibility. It shaped his sense of self and his hunger to be noticed. To understand how Moura's behavior could initially flourish, it is essential to understand the cultural meaning of kissing in Brazil. Brazilian society is defined by proximity. Cheek kisses are routine greetings, exchanged even between near strangers. Touch accompanies speech. Gestures are expansive. Bodies move close in conversation. Public affection is not merely tolerated, it is expected. Emotional expressiveness is valued, while restraint can be interpreted as coldness or hostility. This culture of touch intensified during the late 1970s and early 1980s, as Brazil emerged from 2 decades of military dictatorship. Under authoritarian rule, bodies had been controlled, demonstrations suppressed, gatherings surveilled, gestures policed. Public space was regulated and physical expression carried risk. When the dictatorship ended, freedom returned not only politically but physically. The streets reopened, music spilled into public spaces, concerts grew massive, celebrities mingled more freely with crowds, security protocols were often informal, symbolic rather than rigid. Excess was tolerated, even celebrated, as proof that repression had loosened its grip. It was within this permissive, euphoric environment that Moura discovered a dangerous truth. Physical closeness could override hierarchy. On January 26, 1980, Frank Sinatra performed at Maracana Stadium before tens of thousands of people. It was one of the largest concerts of his career. Security was present, but it reflected the era, visible yet porous, authoritative yet trusting. Mora, reportedly emboldened by a dare and driven by impulse, slipped past the security barrier, reached the stage and kissed Sinatra on the cheek. The act lasted seconds. Its impact was enormous. Sinatra froze. Guards reacted too late. The crowd erupted, laughing, gasping, roaring in disbelief. What made the moment unforgettable was not aggression, but intimacy. Mora had crossed an invisible boundary without force. He had touched the untouchable using affection. In that instant, José Alves de Mora ceased to be anonymous. He became the kisser. The press seized on the nickname immediately. The story circulated as curiosity, humor, and scandal. Mora was suddenly visible, not because of talent or achievement, but because he had violated the unspoken rules separating ordinary bodies from famous ones. For a man long starved of recognition, the effect was intoxicating. What followed was not chaos, it was repetition with refinement. Mora began to pursue similar encounters with increasing deliberateness. Over time, he developed a method that bordered on ritual. He targeted public events with symbolic weight, observed security routines, waited for moments of transition or distraction, approached quickly, kissed briefly, and withdrew. The kiss itself was never prolonged. It was a rupture, a disruption of carefully choreographed distance. Mora relied entirely on shock, not force. By the time security responded, the act was already complete. Psychologically, the behavior resembled compulsive affirmation. Each kiss confirmed his existence. Each reaction, outrage, laughter, confusion, was proof that he mattered. For Mora, attention was not vanity, it was survival. The kiss became more than an act. It became identity. Without it, he was no one. While Mora became a public curiosity, his personal life did not improve. Fame brought no financial stability, no institutional support, and no meaningful integration into society. Family relationships remained strained. Relatives oscillated between concern, embarrassment, and resignation. The attention Mora received was fleeting and transactional. Media interest caricatured him rather than humanized him. He was consumed as spectacle, not understood as a person. Visibility did not produce dignity, it intensified isolation. This is one of the cruel paradoxes of notoriety. Attention without care can deepen loneliness rather than relieve it. Mora's brief fame amplified his sense of self, while providing no structure to contain it. He remained poor, he remained unstable, and he became increasingly dependent on the very behavior that alienated him. In the early phase of his notoriety, Brazil laughed. Television variety shows treated the kisser as comic relief. Newspapers framed him as harmless eccentricity. Cartoons exaggerated his antics. Humor served a purpose. It allowed society to avoid uncomfortable questions about consent, mental illness, and exploitation. But beneath the laughter lay unease. His kisses were uninvited. His targets did not consent. And while the victims were powerful men in public spaces, the logic of the act carried implications far beyond celebrity. Those implications would not remain ignorable for long. The shift from curiosity to concern did not happen overnight. For a time after the Sinatra incident, the kisser occupied a strange liminal space in Brazilian public life, tolerated, joked about, occasionally scolded, but rarely treated as a genuine problem. His actions were framed as audacious rather than dangerous, cheeky rather than coercive. Yet repetition has a way of changing meaning. What begins as anomaly hardens into pattern, and pattern invites scrutiny. As Mora repeated his intrusions, the kiss ceased to be an isolated breach and became a recognized tactic. He appeared wherever power gathered, political rallies, public ceremonies, televised events, moving through crowds with a familiarity that unsettled observers who had once laughed. The act itself did not change, its context did. In each instance, the same choreography unfolded: the sudden approach, the brief contact, the delayed intervention. The kisser relied on the politeness of institutions, on the hesitation that follows behavior no one expects. Security personnel trained to respond to aggression were momentarily paralyzed by affection. The kiss disarmed response precisely because it confused categories. This confusion between intimacy and intrusion was the space the kisser learned to inhabit. Psychologically, Mora's behavior began to display the logic of escalation. The first kiss produced visibility. The second confirmed it. Soon, repetition alone was insufficient. Each act needed greater symbolic weight to deliver the same emotional payoff. The targets grew more prominent, the settings more formal, the risks more pronounced. Observers noted that Mora's confidence increased alongside his notoriety. He moved through public spaces with a sense of entitlement, as if prior success had granted him immunity. This belief that attention confers permission was central to his compulsion. Having breached boundaries once, he seemed to assume they would remain permeable forever. At the same time, the feedback loop tightened. Each successful intrusion reinforced his behavior. Each detention without consequence taught him that the cost was low. The kiss became both reward and justification. It was no longer about affection. It was about access. The most consequential escalation of all occurred during the visit of Pope John Paul II to Brazil. By this point, Mora was no longer an unknown quantity. Authorities were aware of him. He had been detained, questioned, warned. His face was recognizable to police and security teams, yet awareness did not equal control. During a moment of movement amid the crowds, accounts differ on the precise circumstances. Mora managed to reach the pontiff and kiss his feet. He did not kiss the face or hand. He kissed the feet. This detail mattered. In Catholic tradition, kissing the feet is an act of humility, reverence, and submission. In a security context, however, it also represents a profound violation. Mora collapsed devotion and trespass into a single gesture, weaponizing religious symbolism to justify intrusion. The act stunned observers. It was no longer amusing. It was no longer merely eccentric. It was disturbing. With that kiss, the kisser crossed a threshold. He had moved beyond celebrity and into the realm of the sacred. He had demonstrated that even the highest symbolic authority could be physically breached. From that moment on, the meaning of his actions changed irrevocably. The papal incident triggered a shift in official perception. Mora was no longer treated as a curiosity. He became a known security variable, a single individual whose predictable unpredictability demanded planning. Brazilian authorities began implementing explicit countermeasures designed not to punish Mora, but to neutralize him. These measures included circulating Mora's photograph among police and event security teams, issuing standing instructions to identify and detain him preemptively during high-profile visits, removing him from public spaces near airports, hotels, and ceremonial venues, and temporarily holding him during state visits to prevent access to dignitaries. In effect, the state created a soft containment strategy. Mora was not prosecuted aggressively. He was managed. This approach reflected institutional uncertainty. His actions were non-violent. His intent was ambiguous. Traditional legal frameworks struggled to categorize behavior that was invasive but affectionate, disruptive but not destructive. The state's response was pragmatic rather than moral. The goal was prevention, not judgment. For Mora, this shift had devastating consequences. Being known to authorities did not bring clarity or assistance, it brought exclusion. He was no longer surprising security, he was intercepted before acting. The kiss, his sole mechanism for visibility, was preempted. This created a paradox. The very notoriety that had sustained him now ensured his containment. Accounts suggest that Mora reacted poorly to this change. He reportedly lingered near events even when barred, attempting to exploit moments of distraction. Detentions became more frequent. His frustration grew. The sense of entitlement hardened into resentment. He had come to believe that public space owed him access. The denial of that access felt like erasure all over again. As official concern increased, media tones subtly shifted. While television variety shows and cartoons continued to mock the kisser, the laughter grew strained. What once seemed charming now felt repetitive, even menacing. Women, in particular, began to articulate discomfort. The language of consent, largely absent from early 1980s discourse, began to enter public conversation. What had been framed as cheeky audacity was increasingly described as invasion. This shift was not immediate or unanimous. Brazil did not abruptly abandon permissiveness. But the ground was moving. The kisser's actions began to look less like rebellion and more like entitlement. Humor still masked discomfort, but it no longer resolved it. Throughout this period, Morra himself remained profoundly isolated. The state's containment measures did not come with care or support. There is no evidence that sustained mental health assistance was offered. He was treated as a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. Family relationships remained distant. Public notoriety did not translate into private understanding. Morra's identity had been reduced entirely to the act of kissing. Without it, he was nothing. This reduction was cruelly efficient. The public consumed the character and discarded the man. His inner life, his loneliness, his instability, his need for recognition remained unexamined. In this sense, Morra was both agent and casualty of spectacle. By the late 1980s, Brazil's tolerance for the kisser had eroded significantly. Security protocols tightened, public patience waned. The permissive atmosphere of the immediate post-dictatorship years faded as institutions stabilized. What had once been possible became unacceptable. Morra's attempts to repeat his defining act were increasingly thwarted. Detentions became routine. Media attention evaporated. Without novelty, without access, the kisser ceased to function as a spectacle. He did not stop because he wanted to. He stopped because the conditions that enabled him no longer existed. In retrospect, Morra's rise and containment reveal much about the fragility of social boundaries during periods of transition. His behavior flourished in a moment when freedom was exuberant but undefined, when institutions hesitated to assert authority for fear of appearing repressive. Once norms recalibrated, Morra found himself stranded, still driven by the same compulsions, but without the permissive environment that had once indulged them. He became, quite literally, a figure out of time. By the time the 1990s arrived, the figure once known as the kisser no longer generated laughter, shock, or curiosity. He generated absence. The crowds that had once provided cover now provided nothing. The cameras that had once turned his intrusions into spectacle no longer followed him. The institutions that had hesitated to intervene now intervened automatically, often before he was even noticed by the public. José Alves de Morra did not experience a dramatic fall from grace. There was no final scandal, no definitive arrest, no moment of collective outrage that marked an end. His downfall was quieter and more devastating than that. He simply became irrelevant. The collapse of the kisser's public presence was not caused by a change in his behavior, but by a change in the world around him. The kiss, the singular act that had once guaranteed attention, lost its power as a disruptive gesture. Security procedures became standardized. Perimeters hardened, protocols were no longer symbolic. Events involving public figures adopted international security norms. Movement became controlled. Surprise became unlikely. At the same time, cultural attitudes shifted decisively. The concept of consent moved from the margins of public discourse to its center. What had once been framed as audacity or charm was increasingly understood as intrusion. The tolerance that had allowed Morra to operate evaporated. In this new environment, the kiss was no longer ambiguous. It was clearly defined as a violation. For Morra, this clarity was catastrophic. His entire public identity had been built on uncertainty, the hesitation between humor and outrage, affection and offense. Once that hesitation disappeared, so did his relevance. He did not adapt. There is no evidence that he could. As his opportunities vanished, so did the attention that had sustained him. He was no longer discussed in the press. Television moved on. New curiosities replaced old ones. Without repetition, the character dissolved. What remained was the man he had always been, poor, unstable, aging, and largely alone. The details of Morra's final decades are sparse, and that absence is revealing. Public interest had never extended beyond his behavior. Once that behavior ceased, the man ceased to matter. He lived quietly in Rio de Janeiro, far from the ceremonies and stages that had once defined him, surviving on limited means, his health declining with age. Accounts suggest that his later years were marked by isolation and obscurity. The notoriety that had once followed him did not translate into support, stability, or care. Family contact was minimal. There is no record of sustained mental health assistance or institutional support in his final years. The attention he once received had been momentary and transactional. When it ended, nothing remained to replace it. In his last days, Mora was no longer a symbol, no longer a curiosity, no longer a problem to be managed. He was simply an elderly man living quietly on the margins of the city that had once made him infamous. When he died in 2019, his passing was noted only briefly in local reporting. A few lines recalled the strange figure he had once been. There were no retrospectives, no reassessments, no public reckoning. A man who had once disrupted concerts, ceremonies, and state visits disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. The symmetry is striking. Mora spent his life fighting invisibility, briefly conquered it through transgression, and then returned to it completely. In death, as in much of life, he was unseen. The kisser's story endures not because of what he did, but because of what his actions exposed. He revealed how fragile social boundaries can be during periods of transition. In post-dictatorship Brazil, freedom was exuberant but undefined. Institutions hesitated to impose limits for fear of reproducing repression. In that hesitation, space opened for behaviors that tested the edges of tolerance. Mora exploited that space instinctively. He discovered that affection could bypass authority, that intimacy could paralyze response, that a kiss could function as a key. But his story also reveals the cost of permissiveness without reflection. Laughter delayed reckoning. Humor postponed accountability. By treating Mora as a joke, society avoided confronting deeper questions about consent, mental health, and responsibility. When those questions finally demanded answers, Mora was already obsolete. At its core, this is a story about loneliness and the hunger to be seen. Mora did not seek power in the conventional sense. He did not seek money or status. He sought recognition. The kiss was his solution to invisibility, a crude, compulsive method of forcing acknowledgement. In a society where fame and authority are protected by distance, his actions collapsed that distance physically. For a brief moment, he stood on equal footing with the powerful, not through dialogue or achievement, but through touch. That equality was illusory. It could not last. Visibility without structure is unsustainable. Attention without care is destructive. Mora's brief notoriety intensified his identity without offering him any means to stabilize it. In the end, the very act that made him visible ensured his erasure. It is often said that figures like the kisser belong to another time. This is not nostalgia, it is structural truth. In the modern world, such behavior would be intercepted instantly. Security would intervene, law would act. Social media would amplify condemnation within minutes. The ambiguity that once protected Mora has disappeared. Modern societies are less tolerant of intrusion disguised as affection. The boundaries between public and private bodies are more clearly articulated. Consent is no longer optional vocabulary. The kisser was a product of a narrow historical window between repression and regulation, when freedom was being tested without clear rules. Once those rules hardened, he had nowhere left to stand. José Alves de Mora kissed power, fame, and the sacred not because he was invited, but because, for a fleeting moment in Brazil's history, no one yet knew how, or how firmly, to say no. His story is not one of triumph or villainy. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when societies confuse permissiveness with kindness, when humor substitutes for accountability, and when loneliness is allowed to express itself through violation. When the rules finally settled, the kisser disappeared, Brazil moved on, and what remains is not the memory of a kiss but the echo of a question that still matters: how do we balance freedom, affection, and the right to say no?